Okay, welcome. My name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending our webinar on business history today, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat at the end of the conversation today. A few logistical things to consider before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but need to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like, you can include your name and your institution in your question, so the chair can share who's asking the question when we get to it. If you'd like to be part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the recording on our YouTube channel after the session. I'll now turn things over to the chair of our panel today, Philip Scranton from Rutgers University-Camden. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It is my privilege to be a chair for this association's operation today. A simple bit of information. Each of our speakers will talk for about 7 to 8 or 10 minutes. After the 4 talks, we will open up the question function. Beyond that, I don't think any further introduction is necessary, except to make sure that you know that you're at Business History Today. The first speaker from Florida International University is Ken Lipartito, and he will talk with us about business history, theory, and globalization.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone's here. I see some familiar names. I see a lot of new names. So I'm going to give an overview of how I see the field developing both geographically, temporally, and also theoretically. And then I'm going to try to post a copy of my talk in the chat function. So look for that, because I'm going to have a lot of references. And for some people that may be useful to see the bibliographic references that I'm making. So over the past 25 years, business history has evolved from a small field attracting perhaps 90 participants to its annual meeting to an expansive exploration of multiple topics, with attendance at annual meetings now in the 400 to 500 range. Conceptually, the field has moved from a tightly constrained theory linked to economics through the works of Alfred Chandler to wider theoretical engagements with cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, politics, philosophy, and religion. So the field has expanded topically, temporally, and theoretically, and I'm going to look at each of these areas. Business history today is much more global than it once was. Although a large percentage of publications still involve the United States or Western Europe, there's now much more about China, Japan, India, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. Just a quick look at recent issues of the field's journals includes articles on foreign direct investment in Chinese electrification, British banks and Latin American trade networks, entrepreneurs in 19th century Bengal, and the international wine industry. Recent dissertations and books have brought into view Levantine joint stock companies and economic life in the Indian Ocean in the 18th century. Multinational business remains a major topic, though one that includes and goes beyond the classic multinational corporation. Here, one might consider Michael Miller's prize-winning History of the European Maritime World, which looks at trading companies, intermediaries, states, and discusses wars, ports, and cultures. Or Jeff Jones's Global History of the Beauty Business that engages a wide variety of multinational enterprises and connects them to differences in culture, practices, and norms of beauty and cosmetics across multiple societies. If business history has not fully yet decolonized itself, it no longer is just the history of elite, white, native-born men. There's now much more engagement with topics once considered outside the mainstream of the field, notably race, gender, and identity. For example, Susan Lewis's study of female entrepreneurs and proprietors in the 19th century, or a forthcoming book on African-American inventor and entrepreneur Lucian Hedden by Jill Snyder, or Tiffany Gill's book on African-American women in the beauty industry. Business and culture is a thriving area with studies dealing with entertainment, popular culture, everyday life, such as David Sussman's work on the music industry, Vicky Howard's book on the wedding industry, appropriately entitled Brides Incorporated, and an emerging literature on business and religion, such as Joseph Slaughter's Faith in Markets, which connects religious identity and economic decisions. Business history from below is represented in works such as Jennifer Lizot's study of the alternative economy of secondhand clothes and flea market goods outside the formal marketplace, or Andrew Pop's new project on business and the emotions using microhistorical methodologies. Many of the above examples come from the 19th and 20th centuries, but there's been a temporal movement back to the pre-modern era, with works ranging from Francesca Trivellado's books on Jewish diaspora merchants and finance in the late Middle Ages, as well as multiple studies using the Genzia correspondence and papers that sheds light not only the Jewish community of Cairo in the 11th and 12th centuries, but as the Islamic economic world and trade into India and Africa. One effect of this geographical and temporal expansion has been to open up more sources or to use sources in new and different ways. Business records themselves can shed light on multiple issues beyond the obviously economic, ranging from communication and control over distance, the interactions of European powers and native populations, colonial administration, political interventions by private capital, the operation of labor systems, including slavery, the creation of new forms and avenues of consumption, and the structuring of middle-class life. At the same time, business historians look across multiple archives, not just corporate ones, but at state archives, legal papers, private papers, letters and diaries of ordinary men and women below the top or even middle level of management, as well as the architecture of buildings, market spaces, and the design of artifacts and objects. Now, here it's worth noting the relationship between business history and the new history of capitalism. There's much overlap in topics, themes, and indeed personnel between these two areas. As well, both show greater attention not just to what capitalism does, but to how capitalism is made. And here, if I may look to one of our next panelists, Alexia Yates, her work complicates rather than simplifies the property market of fin de siècle Paris, finding a fractured agency, the commodified real estate, rather than a simple reduction of this real estate sector to either the state or the marketplace. Or Mary O'Sullivan's recent essay on profit, which does not just take profit as a force or actor in history, but instead interrogates how profit is made, both in the sense of market activity, but also in the conceptual sense of how profit is recorded, measured, and valued. In general, both groups are engaged in an ontological questioning of what social science takes as fixed and basic categories. This is true of the assembled nature of markets, but also with business organizations themselves, as Joanne Yates's work has shown by examining control, communication, and communities that inhabit the firm, or Dan Wadhwani's work on entrepreneurship, which examines the subjective world-making of the entrepreneur as a necessary part of how opportunities are identified and recognized for business activity, rather than seeing opportunity as simply lying around waiting for actors to take it up. Or Paula de la Cruz Fernandez's forthcoming study of Singer sewing machines in the Spanish-speaking world using the concept of the gendered corporation. Likewise, both fields have turned to the finance and political economy of business. Now, without determining who belongs in which field, we can consider both Richard White and Richard John's work on the American state and infrastructure development, or Stephen Usselman's study of railroad innovation that connects corporations, professional engineers, the state, and the law. An outpouring of works deal with finance, a topic that business historians had often marginalized based on Alfred Chandler's assertion that key corporations in the economy did not rely on external finance, but used internally generated funds. Now, however, historians are looking at the power wielded by financial actors. Historical works consider the frenzied and even irrational side of money through studies of manias, panics, exuberance, and the psychological costs of the frenzied market. Here we can look at Scott Sandage's Cultural History of Business Failure, Ed Bailison's work on bankruptcy and corruption, Jonathan Levy's book on risk, and Sharon Murphy's study of life insurance that, as she shows, aim to provide middle-class security in a market world fraught with risks and hazards. Comparable works are also being written in other parts of the capitalist world as well. More generally, there's a move, and I think this is especially true of business historians, to shift away from convergence and emphasize divergence. Rather than find a one best way that business should be done or that capitalism should be run, more and more emphasis goes on differences and varieties of capitalism, differences of economic systems set in distinct political and cultural contexts. This severs the presumed link between business and modernity. So it's not just the Weberian corporations that are important, but families, networks, business groups, trade associations, even churches, monasteries, and convents, all of which carry out business activities or have in the past. Likewise, the expanded time frame argues against the notion that capitalism is ever present, ready to burst forth as soon as the constraints are taken off. This orientation has driven a revived interest in the works of Carl Polanyi. And here, let me cite my own book with Lisa Jacobson, our recent edited volume, Capitalism's Hidden Worlds, which looks at the way that capitalist and non-capitalist forms articulate with each other. One important difference, though, between business history and the new history of capitalism is that business history is about more than capitalism. Not only does the temporal and geographic reach bring it to places, peoples, and times that cannot yet be characterized as capitalist, it also investigates distinctly non-capitalist economies, indeed even communist ones. Here again, if I can turn to the work of one of our panelists, Phil Scranton, he's written extensively with Patrick Friedenson on communist economies, or Sven Kube's recent dissertation on the East German music industry, to just cite just two things coming out on this topic. So after hearing all this variety, one might be tempted to ask, are there any bounds on what constitutes business history, or who is a business historian? It's a very good question, and it's one that I think we should discuss. But let me say first that many people, including those whose works I've mentioned, might not see themselves as business historians, at least not primarily, though business historians recognize the virtues and values of their works for the field. Breaking down topical, theoretical, and methodological barriers is, I believe, on balance, a good thing. Business history may now be in the process of simply becoming history that happens to focus on particular sets and features of issues in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. And a bibliography will follow, I'm told, almost immediately. We now turn to Philip Tai from Northeastern University, Rethinking Chinese Economic Life and Business History.
All right, hello everyone. Can you see my slide? I just took over the share screen function. So, okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank everyone, to my fellow panelists and to the audience for attending. The purpose of my presentation is to set up a conversation about recent research on business history and the history of economic life. Economic life, I mean by the human participation in consumption, production, and exchange. As a legal and economic historian of modern China, I thought I would just set up this conversation by updating fellow historians on recent developments in my field. So I'm going to offer a very general overview of recent English language research on Chinese business history and Chinese economic life more generally. By recent, I mean research within the last 5 years or so. Besides introducing everyone to new research and developments in the field, I hope that this will also encourage more historians, more specialists outside of China to engage with scholarship on Chinese economic life and Chinese business history. So many of you may already be familiar with the last wave of Chinese business and economic history. These studies coming out at the turn of the 21st century were mostly concerned with challenging older scholarship on Chinese failure. They were challenging, for example, claims that traditional Chinese culture was somehow a barrier to commerce, or that the pre-modern Chinese economy was somehow hostile to large-scale impersonal enterprises. Now, these studies tried to do many things. They tried to reconstruct the operation of Chinese enterprises. They tried to understand Chinese business practices, or they even tried to revisit classic questions of the Great Divergence. Again, in one way or another, much of this research was trying to speak to an older scholarship, trying to address old notions of why did China fail, or why did Chinese businesses not succeed. But in recent years, historians are beginning to ask different questions about Chinese business and Chinese economic history. And this has become especially urgent in the last 2 decades as China has become an even larger player in the global economy. So 40 years ago, when the People's Republic was just about to embark on its market reforms, the Chinese economy stood just outside the top 10 largest economies in the world. After years of rapid economic growth, China's economy today is now the world's second largest as measured by GDP. So China's economy today also has some very interesting features that do not necessarily conform to standard Western economic orthodoxies. So on the one hand, the Chinese economy has largely transitioned from the old command economy to the new market economy. It also has a very large private sector, and it is firmly embedded within circuits of global trade. Now, on the other hand, the Chinese economy still retains the very visible and very heavy hand of the state. Chinese companies, the largest companies, companies in strategic sectors like transportation, banking, energy, industry, and so forth, these companies still remain state-owned or state-controlled. China has very liberal rules promoting export trade, but maintains much stricter rules protecting domestic markets. So how did this come to be? This is just a picture of China's economy today. So what kind of significance can we draw from China's transformation? And how do we write a history of Chinese economic life or Chinese businesses in light of all this development? So scholars in the social sciences are still doing the bulk of the research on the contemporary Chinese economy, but historians are beginning to wade into this debate and sort of offer their own answers to these questions. So from my reading of recent English language historiography, I detect three major research trends, emerging research trends. Now, these groupings are very general, they're very inexact. I'm still trying to give names to these emerging research agendas, but I do think this new research is indicative of how historians have sought to account for the rise of the contemporary Chinese economy and to account for the transformation of Chinese economic life more generally. So let me discuss each of these research trends very briefly. There are many more studies than the studies I will show, including articles and forthcoming publications. So the first trend is what I would call China and the 20th century. So until recently, Western historians of China have shied away from crossing the 1949 divide, 1949 being the year of the Communist Revolution. They've left everything post-1949 to the social scientists. But this has started to change at the dawn of the 21st century, and historians are now writing much richer histories of Chinese economic life and state and economy relations that bridge this divide. So rather than looking at discontinuities or departures, recent studies have also looked at continuities. These continuities include looking at the expanding role of the state in the economy, the longevity of consumer culture, and the ability of businesses to weather different political regimes. And these continuities have crossed different epochs in Chinese history, going from 1978, the Reform and Opening, 1949, the Communist Revolution, the birth of the Chinese Republic in 1912, and even state building efforts by the Qing dynasty at the turn of the 20th century. And this perspective, I think, this very long-term perspective can help scholars better understand which features of the contemporary Chinese economy are indeed new, and which features are more like continuities or more like culmination of these very long-term trends that have been unfolding for quite some time. Another research trend is what I would call China and the world. Now, these studies remain focused on China, but they explicitly put China within a global context, or they try to connect China with other global circuits of exchange, goods, but also ideas. So this new scholarship looks at everything from the adaptation of foreign technologies and foreign expertise to a reappraisal of capitalism's trajectory in China with the trajectory of capitalism in other contexts. And they look at the translation of foreign legal institutions, foreign legal concepts within the Chinese context. Again, the focus remains largely on China, but the perspective these works adopt is much broader, and they also offer themselves to comparisons with different fields. The final research trend I have identified is what I would like to call China and neoliberalism. So in recent years, historians of the United States and the West have generally tried to understand the rise of neoliberalism. This line of research has explored the different ways that the shocks of the 1970s created the global economy that we now know today. deregulation of markets, unimpeded flow of capital, dismantling of the welfare state, the retreat of organized labor, and so forth. Now, this broader history of neoliberalism remains very much in its infancy, but from my reading of the literature, the focus thus far has tended to be on either policy choices in countries like in the industrialized world, or changing intellectual trajectories, like the shift from Keynesian economics to the Austrian school, the Chicago school, or supply side economics. Now, more recent studies like these have tried to write China and the rest of Greater China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the overseas Chinese communities into this broader history of neoliberalism. China was a driver, it was a contributor, and a beneficiary of this shift in the macro dynamics of global capitalism since the late 20th century. So in my opinion, no global history of neoliberalism is really complete without taking China into account. And I'll end my presentation here, but I'm happy to have a conversation with my fellow panelists and with the audience about some of this new research. And I would love to have an ongoing conversation about research on economic life and business history more generally. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. We now move on to Alexia Yates, University of Manchester, who will speak with us about economic life and the margins of business history.
Without implying, of course, until we get to the conversation that will answer this question about margins and boundaries. So yes, thank you to the fellow panelists. And I think that the previous two presentations have sort of set up what I want to say quite well. And we got a little bit from Ken's presentation, for instance, of this sort of this kind of established account that we have now that we've been dealing with for some time in business history, I think, activated in part by kind of the Great Recession and an economic turn in history writ large, in which business history is kind of buffeted by histories of capitalism, by economic history. And so what I want to reflect on today a little bit is its intersection or its brush-ups with the history of economic life. And that's, of course, a term that Philip was just using as important to his work specifically. And I want to suggest that it's approach, and I think it's more of an approach than a field really, can pose useful questions of business history in a way that can blur its boundaries still further than we've already been speaking, incorporating seemingly marginal figures and spaces into the scholarship of business history. The term economic life is a purposefully expansive and flexible term. You can find it in, I think by now, a very well cited, I should say, article by Bill Sewell in History and Theory from 2010, in which he defines economic life very broadly and usefully, in fact, as the history of human participation in the production, exchange, and consumption of goods. So this is probably echoed in how Philip just defined economic life. It's also, doesn't come out necessarily sort of in a doctrinal statement, but is important throughout the works of someone like Emma Rothschild. And you can find it kind of discussed probably most directly in her recent book, An Infinite History from 2021. And she looks at economic life as a history of human consciousness, a history of perceptions and reactions in the presence of economic facts. So in Sewell's definition, while it's faint, we can hear this echo of Marx, for whom the commodity form is among the most important distinguishing and organizing features of capitalist relations. In Rothschild's, we can see the imprint of the Annales school and echoes of Brodel's inquiries into economic and material life. And there are profound differences here about the relative place that capitalism occupies in the social world, but we won't develop those at the moment. The term itself is very rarely used in US history, though I do note Peter Kouklanas's book on the economic life and death in South Carolina. And it's much more commonly used in histories of the rest of the world. So we have actually Philip's book here, dealing with smuggling in China, Fahad Bashara's on the Indian Ocean, Jeremy Edelman's scholarship on South America. And this more expansive geography is also mirrored in its more expansive chronologies. It appears very frequently in works of early modern history, for instance, as much as modern history. And it's used outside history, most commonly in sociology, I think. And it may possibly stretch back to Werner Sombart's use of the term at the turn of the century, but it's in fact, it's a very well-established sort of sociological trope. Now, this kind of transferability across time and space, Ken invoked this at the outset in his talk, right? And its openness to disciplines outside of history is exactly one of the features of the object of study that business historians sort of most value about their topic of study, business. that business need not be cleaved to capitalism nor to the modern. Though in practice, I think the field doesn't take advantage of the topic's mobility sort of as much as it could, and it adheres rather closely in time and space to the modern capitalist world. The transferability of the notion of the potential of business across fields of experience is a direction of movement that I think business history has experimented with still less. As a history of perceptions and encounters with the economic, this notion of economic life, a history of consciousness, this history of economic life, I think, could be more open to a history of subjectivities. So thinking business history with the history of economic life then means histories of the social influence of the social worlds of business. Not histories of business per se, but a history of lives made by business, the conditions of possibility that business makes for people and for the circumstances in which it's embedded. And of course, I think Ken's already cited him, but I can cite Andrew Popp's recent article and his kind of foray into histories of business and the everyday as a place that's raising a lot of similar questions. Getting broadly, I think, at the scope for the place of experience, which necessarily has to be a place, an unequal experience in business history, studying how business shapes the body, how it shapes the emotions, how it constitutes subjects. So my own research reconstructs what I think could be more intimate and everyday realms as it reassesses the history of financial markets in modern France. In one sense, I'm crafting a history from the margins, from the vantage of ordinary individuals who were drawn into and helped shape a changing financial landscape as agents in a mass market of investment, which was being developed in the 19th century. In another sense, it's a project of creating new centers, a project of placing the personal, the domestic, and the local much more firmly within our accounts of the significance of finance and the worlds that it made possible. In a forthcoming article, which in fact I think was actually just published yesterday, so I should have edited that, I explore investor letters, specifically letters that are written by ordinary investors to financial institutions that embody the market, so from the margins to the center, as a way of appreciating the stakes and the meaning, but also the material foundations of investment for modest investors. These letters give us a host of empirical detail about the geography and demography of investment. From one collection at the archives of the Bank of France, for instance, I can collate information on the hundreds of villages and professions of first-time investors. I can follow the operations of particular brokerages. I can learn how individuals encountered investment opportunities and pursued information to better inform their decisions. So we can substantiate the reach of the market. We can better see where its boundaries lay. That's kind of an empirical story that these letters can tell. From the vantage of, from the number of individuals who stress the input of their neighbors in their decisions, for instance, in writing these letters. So if we think about the content, for people who write into the Bank of France because they're concerned by rumors that they're hearing, from letters that are written by bosses on behalf of groups of workers in their towns, we can learn about the social and the collective nature of investment practice, right? The way finance creates relationships and the way it creates networks. But these letters also let us, and here I can use a term that Carolyn Steedman uses to describe kind of like the everyday uses of letters among poor people engaging with the law. They can let us hear better how writers made sense of their situations. So we can hear modest individuals expressing their anxieties about financial decision-making, framing their positions and their entitlements, deploying tactics to rationalize their operations and to receive services. Our findings can transcend the individual story if we have, of course, enough letters, and we will discuss sources, I'm sure. For instance, I've read these letters to see what they suggest about their writer's appreciation of the temporality and spatiality of financial practice, the sense of time and space that finance makes in sort of areas that are far removed from the centers of financial exchange. This is the world of what Marx called the annihilation of space by time. But in fact, these letters offer insights into how the spatial temporal experiences of these individuals was differentiated rather than homogenized, enriching our understanding of the market and the business of finance as an everyday habitus. So I can reconstruct local networks of investment, the way that a particular village engaged with particular brokerages, how they understood and complained about their distance from the center, feeling left out from what was happening in a center that was perceived by them, and in fact was, to be a much better informed site for the financial decision-making that they were concerned with. It can also be visible in how individuals articulate their life histories through these kinds of arguments about finance, the way that they align their past, their present, and their future, and express crisis as a type of temporal break. And of course, these are, letters of these sorts are always going to be letters that are trying to rationalize and persuade, but they nevertheless suggest dispositions and alignments that investment could credibly construct between different spheres, between different temporalities. So looking at financial markets from the margins in, or from the household out, suggests that their elaboration relied on and proceeded through the differentiation of the experience of investment, and importantly, through a multiplication of times and spaces of economic returns. And that's just an example from my own research. And I'm very conscious that I was less generous than my colleagues in talking more about my own research than fabulous research I rely on. That we can open a different perspective on the business of brokerage, for instance, in this particular field. We can ask new questions of the past if we pivot to include more of the life world or of the economic lives that animated this particular sector of exchange. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And our final speaker will be Professor Bianca Murillo from California State University, Dominguez Hills, Histories of Business in Africa, lessons from Ghana.
I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see.
There it goes.
Yes? All
Yes.
good?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you to all the panelists. And I'm really excited to be on this panel. I've already written down a million questions. But I'm Bianca Murillo. I'm a professor of history, and my research and teaching areas are African cultural and social history, global economies, business, but also critical race and gender studies. So my contribution today, Histories of Business in Africa, Lessons from Ghana, is based on my research that's located at the intersection of these three areas. And I'm not going to give an overview of the field of African business history. I think there's some wonderful new scholarship, and we can talk about that later, maybe in the chat and in the discussion. But for now, I want to start with three key questions that have guided my writing, but also my methodologies and my approaches to business history. So number one, what does it mean to put African studies at the center of business history? Number two is, what types of theoretical and epistemological questions emerge from such a vantage point? And number three, how does this shift challenge the assumed knowledge and analytical categories that shape our understandings of markets and exchange? And my fellow panelists have sort of picked up on some of these themes as well in their own research. And today I'm going to address these questions in relation to my own work. My first book, Market Encounters, and Alexia, you used that term, so that's great, was on the history of consumer cultures in Ghana, which is in West Africa. There's a map there, in the 20th century. So based on older African business histories, which are typically dominated by the history of large merchant trading firms or well-known trading families, usually along the coast, my work shifted attention onto African consumers. And for me, that move opened up a whole new way of thinking about who and what we have considered to be part of economic and business history. One example of this is my writing on a group of women called credit customers. And I'll talk a little bit about who they are. They're over in the corner in that image, and I hope you can see it. So who were these women credit customers? During the colonial period in Ghana, the majority of manufactured goods and food were imported from abroad. So everything from large items like cars to everyday staples like salt. So for the most part, this trade was controlled by large foreign trading firms. But the distribution and the sale of goods always rested on local networks. While companies like, and the two big companies here I've done my research on are the United Africa Company and the Union Trading Company, while they operated dozens of retail shops, and you can see some examples in the images that I've provided here, most items found their way into the hands of consumers through credit customers. So, and in Ghana, the credit customer system was dominated by women. So thousands of women who bought merchandise in bulk at wholesale prices and resold to ordinary everyday consumers. And all this buying and selling was done through a company passbook. I have an image of an original company passbook that I'll share. And there we are. So accounts were settled on a month-to-month basis, and each passbook usually contained a photo, the selling district, rates of commission, and credit limits. And these, which would fluctuate over time, these passbooks were actually very, very valuable. They were passed down through inheritance in families, oftentimes. And many of these women would go on to establish themselves as business people in their own right, investing in other types of businesses, as property owners, as transporters, as money lenders. So using the money that they had earned working for trading firms. And it's important to note that credit customers often held several passbooks from a lot of different companies, which companies didn't like. So for me, this relationship between firms and their credit customers, specifically between district sales, merchandise managers, and agents, who were mostly European men, and these women credit customers, became central to the story of business in Ghana, in colonial Ghana. And this relationship was never stable. And by the 1950s, it actually becomes quite contentious. Firms became anxious and began to try and break down the power of some of these credit customers. And of course, colonialism and assumptions about gender and race also shaped these business relationships, as well as corporate policy and the language used to describe African markets. So in the colonial economy, there was a wide gap between foreign business and colonial firms that monopolized the market and everyday consumers, ordinary consumers on the ground. Business history for me became tracing the webs of distribution and the struggles over power that bound together these people and these networks throughout Ghana, but also beyond the continent. So in conclusion, and this is a lesson that's driving my new research, and I have a slide of some of the sources I'm using in my new work, and this is a collection of investors' brochures from around the 1960s. My new project, Financing Africa's Future, is a history of private investment, fraud, and predatory lending in the post-colonial period as African countries begin to gain independence in the 1950s and 60s. The funding of newly liberated colonies required ongoing negotiations of contracts, of credit, and of massive loans. And again, this rested on networks of individuals and networks of institutions that spanned the globe. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. For all of you out there listening to this spectacular group of presentations, your opportunity now is available to ask questions of our presenters. There is a Q&A function in which you can put in your questions, hopefully with some identification of yourself, and I will try to share them with the presenters. If you want to ask of a specific person, please do so in the question so that we know to whom you're addressing it. The initial question, it comes from Dana Cecilia at the University of Maryland for Professor Murillo. Where did the credit customers get working capital?
That's a really specific question. There are actually records in the United Africa Company archive, which is right outside of Liverpool. It's located at the Unilever archives, that talks about the things that the women left with the company. Oftentimes, the most common item was jewelry. So jewelry or family heirlooms, or oftentimes credit customers borrowed capital from each other to get younger credit customers started in the business.
Thanks very much. We have a note from Linda Civitello that Ken's lovely document has disappeared from the screen. And after all the work he put in to try to load it up, he's going to have to do it again at some point. I'm sorry.
I will do it now. Look for it.
Thanks a lot.
Phil, would it be okay if I asked another panelist a question while we wait?
Oh, that's totally unauthorized, I'm sure. No, go ahead, of course.
I think it's a question for everyone, but it's spinning off from Bianca's final presentation there. You know, I was kind of struck by the contrast that you have between sort of the types of images for your first project and the types of images for your current, you know, ongoing work. And you know, I'm just the question is sort of about the shifting of scale and the vantage point of experience, right? Because that's also something that I think, you know, all of us are thinking about the boundaries of this and what type of sources give us what kinds of information, are navigating between those kinds of possibly like very embedded histories with these particular women, their particular pieces of jewelry, even possibly, right? And then moving up to that national and international scale. I mean, do you have, and I'm sure everyone here, you know, is thinking about this in terms of like what their current research does and how you move between scales like that. But do you have thoughts about sort of how, you know, what you're going to, the degree to which you're going to be able to replicate that kind of study as you move forward, and specifically in terms of your concerns about centering people that aren't often included in what we might think of as traditional business history?
Bianca?
Yeah, that's a great question. It also makes me nervous, you know, because I mean, some of the credit customers and their families, like I interviewed them and I used a lot of like, that image came from a personal archive that was literally located in a trunk in a living room. And that's so much different than say my research that I'm doing at the World Bank, right? So, but I think there's an element of, you know, these type, and you talked about it too, your financial records, like it's how we use them as well. Like this social and cultural analysis applied to financial records, like for me, you know, offers a whole new world of being able to, I mean, just ask new questions about your research. This particular project, I feel like some of the more personal stories and oral interviews are based around scandals. So financial scandals or certain investors that came to the country and had relationships with certain ministers or political leaders. And so those stories that circulated in the community. So that's how I'm getting at that for that particular, a certain chapter in the book. Does that answer your question? Yeah, it's difficult. It's a shift.
Roger Horowitz at Hagley has just dropped in and says, presentations emphasize local and national plus variations in diversity and economic activity. Where does that leave the older concern with multinationals as the progenitors of capitalism and responsible for its spread? I think Ken might want to pick this up, but others are certainly willing or eager to respond too.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is we're rethinking what we mean by capitalism and what its boundaries are. So I think if you have a very tight, narrow understanding of capitalism and you see it spreading out from centers to peripheries, then you have sort of one model of how it works. And I mean, you know, that's still a valid model. I mean, that's the way Sven Becker's work, for example, very recent work operates, right? But I also think that you know, this is not an age where global capitalism seems quite as monolithic as it once did, either in terms of the forms it takes, its relationship to states and societies, or its like expansive abilities. And I think part of it is the nature of the multinational is being also questioned and inflected. And you know, a lot of those models were based, I think, on a fairly economic and reductive understanding. So I think we are complicating it, but I think we're complicating what we mean by capitalism, the boundaries between capitalist and non-capitalist relations, the way in which multinationals actually operate in the world. You know, there's power still matters. I mean, obviously there's always a danger when you go in a new direction that you take away something really important from the old, which might be about power, right? The ability of a certain type of organization to impose its forms and wills, but I think we're moving away from a kind of modernist, that modernization theory, which I believe actually is another question in the Q&A, is the role of modernization theory. So I'll stop there and let others pick up.
Anybody else want to chime in, please? Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you very much for that question. I guess I can answer that question regarding multinationals by referring to a recent article that I just wrote on the spread of fire insurance. I guess the spread of fire insurance in China. I suppose that from my perspective as a historian of China, multinationals have been at the forefront of many histories, business histories. But more recent research, from my opinion, still deal with that, but they shift the perspective, not showing necessarily that it's a one-way street of Western firms bringing capitalism, bringing modernity, and so forth, but also just trying to understand how did these institutions or business practices, once they land in China, how were they received, how were they translated, and how were they ultimately deployed. So I think that the concern of multinationals is still ever present, at least in my field, but now the concern now is to shift in terms of perspective, trying to not tell the history of multinationals from the multinationals themselves, or strictly the multinationals, but also understand how it unfolded, how their activities unfolded within China, and also this sort of iterative relationship, trying to understand how, again, it's not a one-way street, but also an interaction between the two. So for instance, again, looking at my research on fire insurance in China, the traditional story is that China did not have any sort of modern insurance until, Western traders came in the 19th century, and then, Western firms, insurance firms began to sell insurance. And but I think that my story looking at a Chinese firm in the 20th century shows how Chinese firms were able to adapt and understand and translate some of these concepts. And then also in looking at the business of insurance in China itself, what we find also is a lot of parallels. In many ways, it's striking how the same challenges of selling, retailing, pricing insurance that Chinese companies had were mirrored, or at least followed by those same challenges elsewhere. So this is one way that I've dealt with it, at least, and I'd like to hear what my panelists how they might actually try to deal with multinationals in their context.
Would anyone else like to take up this issue, or shall we move on? Okay, we'll move on. From Texas A&M University, San Antonio, Kevin Gaona asks a kind of intellectual biography question of the group here. What led you people to do research in business and economic history?
I'm too old to remember, so ask some.
Oh, Kevin, man, already.
Ask the younger ones who can remember how they got into this.
Alexia, what would you say?
Sure, I could start. I mean, I have a distinct memory of, I think my first project on real estate in late 19th century Paris came through, there were two veins, because it was trying to make a few different historiographic contributions. So one of them was trying to find, in a very heavily populated field, something new to say about Paris, and to look in areas that people hadn't looked before. And coming to, troubles with the way that historians, particularly Anglophone scholarship, had tended to deal with the transformations that happened in that particular city. But of course, I was coming to my dissertation proposal stage, and then the carrying out of my research, essentially happened between 2005 and 2009. So I was absolutely shaped by the financial crisis in terms of how I thought about the place of research in, the place of real estate in national political economies. So not only in physical spaces, which had been my first interest, but specifically kind of thinking about it as a financialized asset. It was there. It was always latent at the beginning, but of course it became much more dominant simply because I was, of the environment that this was happening. And it's possible that that was sort of, surreptitiously in my subconscious, even as I was thinking about this as a particular subject, in terms of another way of kind of approaching how the city is organized, and thinking about it, through markets, et cetera. And that absolutely developed very much because of that particular, kind of confluence of events.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ken is ruled out.
I feel like it was accidental. Like a lot of like research paths that you go down are so accidental. I think for me, I was always interested in markets and consumer culture. And if you've been to places in West Africa, there's such a blurred line between economic and social life. It's conversations and hanging out and even like parties in the marketplace. Like there's just such a blurred line. So when I started to do interviews with people and actually do oral interviews with people about markets and working in markets, consumer culture, people started to talk about multinational firms. And so there's a saying, and the company I work on is United Africa Company, and they call it the UAC. That's what Ghanaians call it. So the UAC is Ghana and Ghana is the UAC. And I said, oh my gosh, there's such an intimate relationship or connection with this company. I need to learn more. So actually my interest was generated from the oral histories that I had been doing about the market. And then I sort of followed that trail to the UAC archives, which opened for public research in 2007. So it was timing, accidental, oral histories that sort of pushed me into that direction.
Thank you indeed. Joanne Yates has chimed in from MIT, and she noted that Alexia's talk focused on how business shaped daily experience, which makes her think about the reciprocal, how daily experience reciprocally shapes business, something more salient today, perhaps, by the existence of climate change, the pandemic, and such. So how would historians characterize the way in which daily experience shapes business practice?
I can start, and I'll be eager to hear
this question.
I'll be eager to hear what everyone else has to say as well. But of course, this is partially an artifact, right, of this idea of sort of blurring of boundaries. It will become problematic. It picks up a little bit on something Bianca just said towards the end, right, of sort of this blurring of boundaries between sort of, the economic, the non-economic, the market, the social. Thinking about something like a corporation as actually being, actually, I can think a little bit now of an article, Ken, that you published fairly recently, sort of thinking about the corporation as an assemblage which has a much more porous existence, and which has a kind of existence that needs to be recapitulated in everyday routines. There's an important way that that's not true because of the life that we give something, by virtue of sort of this amazing legal corporate personhood that we've constructed. And then there are other very important ways that it is true. As I said, the daily recapitulation. So I mean, there's sort of, kind of banal examples that I could come up with from my own research about one of the ways that I look, for instance, at the types of popular investment that were developing in the 19th century in France. A lot of it is being designed and is being designed to appeal to by the time we get to, say, the second half of the 19th century, to ever more modest classes of individuals, and things like bonds, things like, I spend a lot of time, apologies to people who've heard me speak about it before, about lottery bonds, are actually designed to be familiar to people and to be marketed to them in ways that they, can fit, say, their work and their pay rhythms, to engage them in the market. So there's a way that, with those kinds of instruments, those kinds of, and even the sort of the expectations that are built into the returns that structure these instruments, are an alignment between things that we might call, and this, I guess, touches on the modernization thing as well, right? The traditional, the social, the cultural, and the modern, right? How do we make this this incredibly new thing, this mortgage bond, for instance, that gets invented in mid-19th century France? It's a whole new legal structure of a mortgage. How do we make this palatable to people? and how do we get it taken up? And one of the things that they do is to link it to practices that are already very popular, pastimes that are already very popular, like the lottery, like gambling, all the while perpetuating this discourse about how, of course, investment is nothing like gambling. So that's one way that you can sort of see quite concretely that this permeability and this kind of two-way influence is incredibly, it's quite tangible. But I think the question points to kind of more complex directions that those sorts of concrete examples won't necessarily exhaust. So I'll be eager if anyone else has anything to say.
Thanks. Ken?
Well, I mean, the examples, Joanne, you gave are huge, right? I mean, climate change, it is everyday life in the sense that I guess it's affecting, it could affect us all in our everyday life, but it's also like, massively existentially global too. So I mean, I think the way I understood what Alexia was getting at, was a lot more micro. And I think trying to uncover these hidden, like, micro level things is a slightly different project, I think. But I think the idea of the reciprocity, if you want to stay at the level of really everyday life, fairly banal and mundane things, this idea of there being a kind of reciprocity between the way in which business shapes consciousness, subjectivity, possibilities, and then what happens back in the actual, I mean, part of it is also, where do you draw the boundaries of business? What constitutes a business? We're talking about, I mean, we get back to all these questions, ontological questions. But even if you were to say, a fairly traditional definition of like business as business enterprise or corporation, I mean, that sort of reciprocal relationship, I think Paula's work on gender and Singer sewing machines takes up some of these issues, the reciprocity between the two. I think that's a really interesting area to explore, right? I mean, there has been, of course, the tradition is a kind of top-down, model of how business operates. Or if you're a very, like true neoliberal or true Hayekian or something, you'd say, well, no, business is merely responding to the will of the consumer. But I mean, if you're looking at business as an institution that can impose to some extent its will on the conditions of the world, thinking in terms of a reciprocity, I think is probably a very fruitful way. I think a lot of that has to be mapped out. So, I will give a little answer to the question, how did I get into this? It literally came when I was like 17 years old, and I was in a very strange high school history experience. I actually read in high school Gabriel Kolko's The Triumph of Conservatism, that kind of quasi-Marxist interpretation of progressivism. And I became convinced that everything could be explained by economics. Like any 16 or 17-year-old, you have a reductive view of the world and you say, aha, I now know the secret to history. And so I studied economics and then got into history, and then became more, I mean, to some extent, this complication of what economics offered led me to things more like business history, because economics was too, narrow and reductive. So I never consider myself completely like a business historian separate from economic history or history of technology or I think what Alexia's nicely identified as economic history, economic life. I mean, I think all of these are fairly interconnected categories that we kind of all work with. It's a shame in the one sense, business history has had an identity, but in the sense it's also been a limiting thing. And so, I'm hoping that with the AHA opening up a whole panel on this, that we're actually more and more people say, oh, business history, or I could use business records, or I could do forms of business history, or what I'm doing could be thought of in the category of business history. Maybe I should talk to the business historians. It's partly, I think, what we are about. But yeah, I think that, I know it's not a complete answer to what Joanne was asking, but I think this idea to me of, complicating the economic life that Alexia described in this kind of reciprocal way suggests a very fruitful avenue for future research to me.
If I can exercise the chair's privilege, I think I could address some main part of what Joanne was asking. In my research on socialist Hungary currently, there's a simple thing which affects a very larger environment. And that is that most Hungarian families in this period, the 1950s and 60s, expected to have fresh meat for Sunday dinner. You would expect that in an environment of totalitarianism, the government would decide when people would have fresh meat, but no, not so fast. The state learned that it needed to deliver fresh meat to the stores on Fridays and Saturdays. And in order to do that, that affected the slaughterhouses' operations on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And in order to do that, there had to be logistics. There had to be animals hauled from the countryside to the towns and to Budapest on Mondays and Tuesdays. And that meant that the previous weekend, there had to be buyers out in the countryside purchasing animals for slaughter. All of this because people expected to have meat for Sunday dinner. So everyday life penetrated the entire structure of food provisioning, and to a degree, structured it. Next question we have comes from high school, Kempsville High School in Virginia Beach, from Kelly Shutlin in the Entrepreneurship and Business Academy there. She asked each of the presenters, what is one thing you think modern high school students should learn and understand about your field of study that would make them more successful in business or entrepreneurship today? What one thing should people in a high school environment know about the field?
I feel comfortable starting with something wrong, and then everyone else can correct me. And by the end, we'll have a very good lesson for these students. History. And not just, not even any history, but I think there's a way this conversation could go in another direction in terms of sort of like, how do we think about business history, not just talking to economic history, not just talking to history of capitalism, not just talking to history, like what are we doing here with these institutions? And why would how do we bring out all these shy business historians, right, who we think are secretly doing business history, but for some reason don't want to call it business history? We need to give them something here that makes them want to be part of the party. And so business history needs to think about what it's doing with historicity, and what kind of critical interventions it's making in this. But I think one of the things I think is like thinking of businesses, thinking of economic activity. So let's say entrepreneurship for students who are actually trying to make a living out of these things, right? As things that are laden with history, with heritage, and with memory. That's how these institutions replicate themselves. That's how a person, operating in any given local environment is going to be able to capitalize on sort of local networks and knowledge. It is knowledge and information, of course, from their environment. And it's about understanding and mobilizing how people in particular places think about their economic lives in the past, right? And we can see really great projects around this, about thinking of, say, like the memories of financial crises, right? How people invest today, for instance, in parts of, say, northwest England, where I am, right? It has a lot to do with particular local banks and when they had the way they failed, kind of within living memory. You can track people, that people have memories of people standing outside of banks, and when there's a run on Northern Rock, right? And people are trying to get their savings back out. That's a tangible way that people learn about what the market can do for them and what its dangers are. And so it's, to impress upon people that like kind of a historical disposition towards the activities that they undertake is actually, it's smart and it's important because it's real. And, of course, let's hope also profitable.
Thanks very much, Alex. Philip, would you want to chime in?
I would like to chime in, and I'll chime in by way of just briefly also wrapping in my own biography. Between my time as an undergrad and as a graduate student, I actually spent several years working in the private sector, working in consulting, working in finance, actually real estate finance of all things. So, Alexia's, discussion about mortgages, it really reminds me of my old job. And I will say that I majored in history, but I spent my time working in the private sector, in those sectors where, most of my coworkers were business or economics majors. And I was also, during the time that I worked in the private sector, 2000 to 2005, I was sort of at the forefront, or at least I had front row seats in two major bubbles. The first bubble being the dot-com bubble, and also the real estate bubble, which will eventually led to the financial crisis of 2008. And I would say that what history helped me to think about was to sort of challenge or think critically about some of the discourse that was sort of weaving around those sectors. You know, this time is different, you know, or like, you know, the new thing. And it wasn't so much that I had history. You learn history, you're somehow prescient. You somehow can predict the future. This, I suppose, is also addressing one of the other questions. But I think that what history does do, as Alexia suggested, is to also make you think more critically about, like, well, what is it that I'm looking at right now? Is it new? Are there any parallels? And also, like, you know, what are sort of like the variations of what we're seeing, and how do we think about that? And I remember having conversations with people, you know, when I was in the, you know, working, and just asking them, you know, don't you think this is a bubble? You know, back in you know, the days in Holland, you know, the tulip mania, and blah blah blah. And of course, people were like, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And I think that kind of historical knowledge can, I wouldn't say inoculate, but perhaps build up some sort of healthy skepticism to process, to contextualize, and also basically challenge accepted narratives. I mean, you know, whenever you hear on CNBC or whatever those business channel talk shows have, they throw out a lot of concepts, and sometimes it's really good to have that historical knowledge and say, you know what, I'm not sure if that's actually the first time this has happened. So that's just my very modest suggestion on the importance of history in business and entrepreneurship. And also, of course, history also pushes against this narrative of the entrepreneur as a hero, as like this sort of you know, this man, usually man, who comes in and doesn't really, you know, we need to think about context, and also you know, sort of like the larger legal, you know, cultural context in which that entrepreneur succeeded. So that's it.
Thank you very much. I
I'll
think
pick
we
up
need to
just.
go on. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
No, just a quick,
briefly,
yeah, briefly. No, just to pick up, depending on who your students are, I would say the point that Philip just made is actually a really good one. And again, I think business historians have started to do some of this, the kind of decolonization of the field, that there in fact are many, you know, it's a very simple thing, but for a high school student that might be useful. There are many types of people who have engaged in entrepreneurial activity under often very difficult circumstances, including slaves themselves. That could be which I use a lot in my teaching because of the diverse nature of the student body at my university. I try to open them up to lots of actors in history who've overcome really difficult circumstances through forms of entrepreneurship. I mean, that's a little bit heroic, but it's also heroic of people who are themselves often oppressed or under difficult circumstances. That can be liberating for a certain type of student.
Thanks, Ken. We need to move on because we have only so much time, and we still have a little pile of questions here. Patrick Sheridan, a graduate student at the College of Charleston, asks, a lot of traditional business history focuses on the economics involved. How might we use business history as a way to understand social interactions and hierarchies apart from purely economic transactions?
I'm thinking it's a good question. I don't want this person to think that because we're silent for a moment thinking about it, it's not a good question. It is a good question. You know, and it's also a question that follows really logically from this discussion we're having, a sort of a blurring boundaries, right? Well, so how far are we going to go, right? So how much of the world story could we tell from the vantage of business? And of course, if we want to tell all the world story, we better have a really good definition of business. So it kind of pushes against blurring boundaries. But you know, do we need something really solid there at the middle to then be able to tell, you know, sort of to build a whole world out of them? I mean, I can, you know, reference a really, what was a classic text for me? And so this could come back to a little bit of the intellectual biography style question, right? One of the first business history books I think that I approached was Stephen Harp's book about Michelin, which is a book about the French company of Michelin. Each chapter based around sort of a different aspect of actually the kinds of things that this company in the 19th century was concerned about. And so just to name a book that someone could pick up and take an example of this. I mean, he tells stories about the engagement of the governors of this firm in, particularly one that stands out to me was, for instance, in France's kind of pro-natalist campaign at the end of the 19th century, right? These guys were hugely into because they were big French nationalists. And of course, then you can tell, you can take the kind of the fact that it's a tire company. He then, I know Steve Harp went on to write a book about, the history of rubber and rubber cultivation, and, in the French Empire. So of course you can spin out from a particular business into all these other domains, which from that vantage, I suppose, sort of just takes the business aspect as a platform, right? What that author wants to explain is not necessarily how that business really operated, what its success was, maybe even basic question about like how many workers there were might not matter if you get a really interesting kind of quite dynamic entrepreneur who's actually does, sort of encapsulates so many of the other kind of powerful currents of their generation. So, there's certainly a way of doing that. The question then is again, sort of becomes a definitional one about like at that point, what is your business history of? And it's not a bad thing. It's to sort of to ponder. It's very productive.
And I wanted to add something to that, because I mean, in my research, economic transactions are never pure. So that sentence was so interesting to me. Like in my research, they're always social affairs. Like for me, I cannot. By the time now I'm starting the second book, but I'll never see them as separate. And I even think about like the negotiation of credit and massive loans in places like West Africa. It didn't happen in like corporate boardrooms. It didn't happen in like offices. It was happening at like seaside vacation homes, high-end, hotel lobbies. It was happening when African politicians went to Europe to vacation at a summer home of an investor. So for me, they've always been social affairs. So I think that's why it was hard for me to answer, because pure economic transactions, I've never thought of them that way.
I just want to add something to that. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Ken can speak to this. My understanding is that business history these days is very, very expansive and capacious in what it can encompass. So for instance, I recall it may be enterprise and society, it may be business journal, business history, journal business history or something. People looking at, for instance, proselytization, religious orders, using concepts from business history, trying to apply that in looking at how organizations would try to convert or spread the message. So basically employing concepts and tools from one field and looking at a field that supposedly has, at least on the surface, has no economics involved. But as Bianca mentioned, these categories are not so clear cut. Everything is interrelated. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thanks so much. From Mount Holyoke College, Desmond Fitzgibbon writes to us, I'm curious to know how each presenter would situate the impact of or visibility of business history in the other fields that may have shaped their development. How widely seen is business history, say, in French, Chinese, or African history?
I mean, I'm going to give a somewhat reverse answer to the question. But obviously Bianca, Alexia, and Philip can really answer for the specific geographic fields mentioned. But my actual impression is that business history, in terms of like publications and things that appear in journals and books that some of the books that Philip put up or that Alexia mentioned, Actually is fairly common in other parts of the world. It's the United States that has the problem with it, right? It's the United States that has sort of marginalizes business, even though we're the business culture, that history has tended to, I think, marginalize business history more so, partly because of the size of the profession in the United States. You can be highly specialized, but you mentioned, Alexia mentioned Stephen Harp's book, I could think of in British history. I would mention something like David Hancock's work, Citizens of the World. I think in German history and Japanese history and elsewhere, business as a topic is just not seen as something that, oh my God, you're doing business history, now we have to disown you. It's obviously a lot better now, but in the US, was kind of the tradition. If you were doing business history, you were kind of marginalized. Oh, you're a business historian. Sorry, that's nothing to do with social history, cultural history, political history. Maybe you can talk to the economists, otherwise leave us alone. So that's maybe coming from my experience over a period. Maybe now it's changing, but that's the way I see it.
What about the specific field part of the question?
Maybe I can just jump in real quickly. I would say that in my field, in Chinese history, unlike other fields, never really, the cultural turn obviously affected my field as well. But the field of Chinese history never really abandoned questions of economy or questions of business. And I think that, the concern with businesses and economies in general is very mainstream. And also, as someone who went into graduate school, again, someone who worked and was very interested in questions of business, I was actually surprised when I went into graduate school how people, poo-poo the idea of studying economy or studying businesses. I mean, these were my fellow graduate students who were cultural historians. That, of course, changed after the financial crisis. All of a sudden, everyone wanted to talk about economy and capitalism. So I think this may be a field-specific phenomenon. And also, I think that at least I think I welcome this turn back into focus on the economy, especially among U.S. historians. I believe it was Richard White, the historian of 19th century United States, who once marveled, this was in the early aughts, that historians have essentially evinced no interest in business, even though businesses are probably the one institution that affect everyday life in so many ways. Not that everyone should look at business, but like considering the amount of interest in other institutions, organizations, other facets of everyday life, events shown by historians versus what they've shown for business. I mean, the disparity is quite stark. So I think that a recognition that businesses are very important in everyday life, which it sounds obvious, but it may be until only recently that historians, especially American historians, have waded back into that field. So that's my perspective.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Bianca, Alexia, either of you want to pick this up?
I would also say it's just also a practical thing, because access to sources and access to archival collections, like I mentioned, the United Africa Company through Unilever, their whole collection just opened and was cataloged for public researchers to come visit in 2007. So that's so recent. And I know the World Bank is now digitizing records that it has on Africa, and that's this year, So it's also access to resources, and what's there is becoming more available for me in my field.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I could just say, I mean, in French history, for instance, and this is probably the same, it hasn't specifically come up in the other comments, but we have to deal both with sort of, where does it sit in Anglophone French history, and where does it sit in Francophone French history? And then within that, a consideration of sort of what does, say, an American Anglophone historian of anything really, actually, what does an American Anglo historian want of a French historian versus what a UK one wants of a French historian? So I would say it's easier to do, say, like a business French history in the UK a little bit than it is in the United States. There's simply something, if someone is going to be a French historian and come to your department, it's not part of the dominant narratives of what people expect to hear sort of about and from French history. So, it does run up against some sort of just a sort of running at cross purposes to expectations. So, I won't go on about it. I recently co-edited a special issue of the journal French History, which was specifically about sort of exploring French history and its intersection with the new history of capitalism. And which I think is partially, it was very interesting and it was fun. It was a fun thing to do. And it was something to reflect on where economic history, but really sort of engagement with capitalism sort of has and hasn't featured over time particularly in Anglophone French history. But on the other hand, it was also sort of a foolish venture because I think I was, we were all thinking in categories which I think didn't necessarily make sense in the way that we would like them to make sense, because I think I think taking this sort of, I think what is a very, Ken put this really well, like a really U.S. history move around the history of capitalism, and it's intoxicating, it's exciting, and I think so much of that work is so great, but it's embedded in a conversation and trying to do a thing which actually isn't that relevant for the fields outside the United States. So it was really productive for our thinking, but in some ways, actually, it was a conversation of like two different languages. That it's still something good came out of it, but it's a more layered relationship, I would say.
Thank you very much. We have one last and I think big question that's sent to us from Mary Yeager at UCLA. She writes, business is positioned differently in various economies over time, given the important new emphasis on perception, emotion, cognition generally. What has this new work told us about the way people learn and know about this? More so, I'm interested in how this new work either addresses or sidesteps questions of inequality and power. That's going to take a moment to process. Inequality and power, people.
I mean, I feel like I just spoke, so I want to wait, but I have things to say.
Go on, nobody else is being adventuresome.
One of the ways that I'm explicitly trying, and I think this actually, it came to my mind when Bianca was giving her presentation as well, which is about sort of who do we center in our stories? And of course that who we center in our stories gives us new stories, and then it also, it demands framing questions in different ways, because sometimes, trying to insert a new actor to a story actually can't answer the old question, right? The old question has to end up going away in the process. You might have started there, become interested in something, and then you need to reframe it. I encounter that all the time by trying to think of what is the significance of thinking of this figure that I'm thinking of, the ordinary investor, right? These small people. I think there's most of you can explain financial globalization at the end of the 19th century without knowing what an oyster merchant in the town of Yates in France, thought about his investments. So if you care about those people, then your story has to change. And the thing you're explaining has to change, sorry. And so, one of the points of sort of starting from the margins is about finding the spaces that have been marginalized in both our stories and in the processes. And one of the things I try to do in telling this different story of finance is explicitly to think about it in terms of unequal access, which is not to say that there's a triumphant story of a market and everyone should have equal access to it because then they'd all be great. But a market that is constructed through differential access. All of these letters that I look at, for instance, these are people who write because they have no other way of figuring out how the market works, right? This is an archive of people who have no access, who don't get information, so that the issue of cognition is there. So they write directly to the head of the Bank of France. Obviously they're more empowered than someone who can't write at all, or use a commercial directory to figure out that address. But this is people, and there are people who are very cognizant that they're being left behind, particularly in kind of obviously in a spatial sense, but also in sort of an economic sense. And that fuels, that's where politics comes in. That fuels quite a bit of fin de siècle populism. We can find these sorts of political popular upheavals stemming from these processes. So I think absolutely that shift your lanes, include different actors, and always keep the fact that this is a story of intentional inequality, productive inequality, right? Lucrative inequality at the heart of the story.
Thank you very much. Inequality in power, any other takers?
Yeah, I mean, there's also a whole new crop of scholarship that's popping up within the last, I would say, 5 years about how financial systems reproduce inequality, you know, through banking, through tax law, through credit. And those are really, and a lot of that work also inspires me to think more on the global perspective, because at the end of the day, I mean, it was just this month, I think, you know, Ghana made international headlines because it sold its national debt, which is $3 billion US, to private investors in the form of discounted bonds. And so for me, that has such a historical story and gives us some new questions to think about global disparities of wealth. But I mean, this is something new, and these are the types of things that I'm grappling with now in this new project.
I mean, in some ways, the answers, I think both Bianca and Alexia were really good answers to Mary's question. But I mean, you could make a case that business history actually has traditionally sidestepped issues of power because they've looked at it from the point of view of the manager, the entrepreneur, the owner, the CEO, the Alfred Sloan. I mean, that it's a system that just has a certain logic to it that works itself out, and what the consequences are for everyone else, they get Model Ts maybe or something, you know. So in some ways, starting from the margins or the bottom, or actually gives you more access to questions of power. Obviously, there's always the danger. I think social historians, you know, years ago were accused of this by focusing so narrowly, you know, on the social life. It did ignore larger structures, but you know, business history itself, I think it's going to be hard for us to ignore larger structures, because that's kind of one of the defining things of the field, right? Capital, corporations, markets. So in some ways, this could be liberating in terms of issues of power. I'm really struck, Alexia, by the talk you gave. You know, I think you pulled together a lot of things that are really at the cutting edge, thinking about you know, how businesses structure experience, cognition, subjectivity. And after all, I mean, wasn't Foucault the one who told us that by studying how institutions structure subjectivity, we actually get access to power in a way that, you know, that traditional definitions of power don't. So this could actually bring power into business history, at least the way I'm understanding what Bianca, Philip, and Alexia are proposing, which seems to me to be right at the cutting edge of where the field's going.
Well, I'll answer that question by referring to my own research. I wrote a book on the history of smuggling in China, trying to understand how ordinary trade was steadily transformed into smuggling through regulation, policing, and taxation of trade, of commerce. And looking at that long arc in Chinese history, one might suspect, one might assume that this steady tightening of state strictures might favor larger incumbents or larger firms. And indeed, when you look at the historical record of, you know, smugglers, the people who get caught are usually not, you know, big shots. They're usually petty smugglers, you know, people like women, ethnic minorities, and so forth. But in my research, I also would want to also challenge, you know, the perception that somehow this is, you know, a story of the state descending upon ordinary people, and ordinary people are just crushed underneath that. In fact, what I've discovered was that, you know, ordinary people, or these petty smugglers, also had ways to respond to state strictures or policing in very creative ways. You know, for instance, women who participate in smuggling could use stereotypes of feminine weakness to their advantages, you know, pretending that they're pregnant or carrying babies, which were not babies, or they were not pregnant, they were just carrying smuggled goods. And also the fact that sometimes smuggling offered an opportunity for certain nimbler organizations, whether you want to call them, you know, illegal or illegal, to sort of get into certain markets. So for instance, when the government, Chinese government, raised taxes on all these goods, many of the established incumbents, many of the multinationals, they didn't like the fact that they had to pay these taxes or tariffs, but they agreed, okay, fine, we'll pay these tariffs and we'll sell our goods. But for mid-size or small businessmen or smugglers, they didn't have to pay attention to that. So they actually benefited from the increase in taxes. Of course, what they were doing was illegal. But they, so I think from my research, it's hard to say that inequality and power operated in certain expected ways. So I think that from at least my research, I was able to see it in different lights depending on who we're looking at. So.
Thank you very much. I believe we've run out of our question list, and we have just about run out of our time. So I want to thank all 4 of our presenters and our very thoughtful questioners from those folks who attended this session, and wish you all the very best. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.